Hello everyone, friends. Welcome to the channel where we reveal the most terrifying and frightening stories, now from words to deeds. Imagine an ordinary suburb. Solid identical houses, manicured lawns, silence. But each of them keeps its own secrets, and some of them are so terrible that people do not even think how close the real horror can be. Let's start with one such story. Her characters are two families who once lived next door and spent Halloween together. The usual tradition. They gathered, decorated houses, had a small party with costumes, and, of course, a mandatory trip for sweets. But this Halloween is the last one they will spend together. These families have been friends for more than 10 years, met every Friday for dinner, went on vacation together. However, closer to the last Halloween, one of the children, the Miller family's son, 15-year-old Josh, began to behave strangely. He became withdrawn, irritable, and spent hours alone in his room. When his parents, Sarah and Dan, tried to talk to him, he shut down even more. Josh said he was just tired, but his parents noticed how he was getting gloomier every day. One day, his father, Dan, noticed that Josh began to go out at night, disappearing from the house for a long time. When Dan asked him what was going on, his son replied that he was just going for a walk to get his thoughts in order. But he never explained what those thoughts were. Sarah began to notice the loss of things from home. At first it was small things, one of her favorite bracelets, a strange carved box that a friend gave her. Later, the money began to disappear, although Josh himself stubbornly denied that he had taken it. On the eve of Halloween, Sarah decided to talk to Carol's neighbor, the mother of Lisa, Josh's best friend. However, as it turned out, Lisa has also been acting strangely lately. She began to avoid her parents, hid in her room more and more often, and, as it turned out, also left at night. When Carol tried to ask her directly, she closed off and said only that everyone will understand Sue. When Sarah and Carol discussed the behavior of children, they decided that teenagers were just going through a typical age crisis. Halloween this year was supposed to help bring them back to their old rhythm. Parties, costumes, laughter, and a little harmless fun. It was decided that the gala dinner would be held, as usual, at the Miller house. However, when Halloween evening arrived, the atmosphere in the house seemed tense from the very beginning. Josh and Lisa looked distracted and pale, barely keeping up a conversation. Every time someone tried to talk to them, they exchanged brief glances, as if they were hiding some secret. When the rest of the family and neighbors joined the dinner, Carol, feeling anxious, tried to attract Lisa's attention, but she only replied with a dry, "Mom, let's not do it now." The holiday seemed to be going a little nervously, but the guests tried to bring back the fun by asking each other about Halloween plans, costumes, and upcoming events. Dan, trying to create a festive atmosphere, invited everyone to tell scary stories. Lisa, suddenly animated, was the first to take the floor. "What if I tell you about our school?" she said, looking at Josh. A sarcastic smile flashed across her face, and she began to tell a story about how all the windows and doors in the old wing of the school were closed, ostensibly for safety, but for some reason everyone who went there alone heard strange noises. At this point, the adults, although they laughed, noticed. Lisa talked about it with an unusual confidence and coldness for her. And then Josh added, "But no one has seen what's inside. Maybe it's not the sounds at all." These words seemed to burn everyone at the table. Josh got up and, giving his parents a dismissive look, went to his room. Lisa followed him. The adults looked at each other, not knowing how to react. After a few minutes, Sarah decided that the conversation had gone too far, and went upstairs to check on what the teenagers were doing. She went to the door of Josh's room and knocked, but there was no answer. Pushing open the door, she saw that the room was empty and the window was ajar. Behind him, in the dark on the street, the figures of her son and Lisa were visible. They were walking somewhere without looking back. Alarmed, Sarah ran to Dan. She tried to explain, but her voice was shaking. "Josh and Lisa are gone. They just ran away from home, as if they were up to something." Dan immediately rushed to the door, followed by the others. They split up and went to look for the teenagers through the streets and the nearby forest. More than half an hour had passed, but there was no sign of Josh and Lisa. At some point, walking around an empty lot on the outskirts of the neighborhood, Dan noticed movement at an old house that had been empty for a long time. The windows were locked, there was no electricity inside, but because of the sparse lanterns, two figures could be seen gliding between the rooms. Dan looked closer and realized that it was Josh and Lisa. They were standing inside an empty house, as if they were looking for something. Dan hesitated before deciding to enter, feeling a strange mixture of fear and excitement. Taking a flashlight, he walked through the weeds and dirt to the sagging door. A slight creak echoed through the empty house when he pushed it, and immediately saw that the children were looking at him with faces that read either anger or incomprehension. "Josh, what are you doing here? What's going on here anyway? What is it?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. But Josh didn't answer. He looked at Lisa, and she slowly, almost indifferently, shrugged her shoulders, as if to show that all this was just a game for her, and Dan should not interfere. But this silence only fueled his anxiety even more. "We found something here," Lisa finally said, as if it was something ordinary. "You didn't know, did you? This house belonged to a family that once lived next to us." Her voice trailed off, and she glanced quickly at Josh. Dan remembered that the house had been empty for many years. It stood on the outskirts, surrounded by weeds and dilapidated fences. Some of the neighbors said that the previous owners left suddenly, abandoning almost all their belongings. But neither he nor Sarah had ever thought about what could actually make people leave home so suddenly. "Why are you here? What are you looking for here anyway?" Lisa narrowed her eyes and said, looking straight at him, "We knew there was something left in the basement." Josh accidentally came across an old note, something like a diary, abandoned in the attic of our school. It said that someone had left traces of the past here, and they should be in the basement. While she was talking, Josh opened the door leading to the basement. Dan immediately felt a damp, musty smell coming out of the dark doorway. He realized that he could not leave the children alone, and, holding a flashlight, carefully began to follow them down the stairs. It was cold and dark in the basement. The plaster on the walls was crumbling, and the wooden beams were barely holding on, creaking under every step. The lantern picked out scraps of old furniture, debris, remnants of things that once may have belonged to people who lived here. Several old crates were lined up along the wall, and dust and dirt covered every inch of the room. Lisa and Josh stopped at one of the boxes, and while Dan was watching them, Lisa reached out and pulled out a stack of old letters from a pile of trash. "We found them last time," Lisa said. "It says here that this family was trying to hide something important." She hesitated a little. "Someone tried to intimidate them. And that was the last Halloween they lived here." "Intimidate? By what?" Dan asked, feeling a chill run through his skin. "It looks like they were being chased," Josh replied, finally speaking. His voice was low and he wasn't looking at his father. These letters, they were warnings, with threats, but they didn't believe it until it was too late. Dan looked at the papers in the children's hands with horror. The corners were torn. The ink was barely visible on the yellowed pages, but the meaning of some lines could still be made out. There were phrases: "Do not think that you will be able to escape. We will be watching you. Your children are in danger." Strange threats that may have seemed crazy or a joke at the time. While Dan was trying to make sense of what he had read, Lisa opened another letter, which, apparently, was written by one of the parents. It mentioned that someone had left notes on their doorstep, and every day their contents became more sinister. "They turned me in. I can't hide anymore. But if they do find me, they won't stop. Take the children away. Make sure they don't see what's hiding in the basement." With every word, Dan felt a chill creep over his body. The words were simple, but there was something in them that did not fit into my head. He was trying to figure out what it was about, and who these people who allegedly harassed the family were. But there was something else. In the corner of the letter, as if by accident, a strange number was added, 19. At first glance, it didn't make sense, but Dan couldn't shake the feeling that it was some kind of clue, a clue. Why was it so important? He didn't know, but the feelings of anxiety only grew stronger. What does this figure mean? He asked the children quietly. We thought it might be something like an address, Lisa replied, handing him another letter, where the number 19 was repeated again, but in a different context. This letter mentioned a man who allegedly disappeared without a trace, but it is strange that his last letters were addressed not to his family, but to some unknown persons. Dan took a deep breath and looked at the children. They were engrossed in this investigation as if it was just a game. But one thing was clear to him. Something was wrong here. There were too many coincidences, too many strange circumstances that did not add up to one picture. We have to get out of here, he said, trying to pull himself together. It's all too dangerous. But Lisa didn't react. She continued flipping through the letters as if she hadn't heard him. Josh was already at the basement wall, looking for something in the shadows, his body sliding on the wet surface. Dan took a step towards him, but then he noticed something glinting from behind the old boxes. He came closer and saw that they were old photographs covered with dust. They depicted a family that once lived in this house. All the photos were taken in different years, but each had the same strange detail. One of the figures always remained hidden, as if someone was trying to cut it out of the frame. The faces in the other pictures were cloudy, blurred, and even from the expressions it was possible to understand that the people in them felt danger, anxiety. What does this mean? Dan said aloud. Lisa finally raised her head, and her gaze was cold and empty. It's all part of what's left here, she said. And you haven't figured out what happened yet. You should know that this family, they tried to hide, but they couldn't. Dan felt a chill run down his spine. He realized that they had not found anything good. They didn't just find a random note or old stuff. They came across something that was left here for a reason. The records, the photos, the numbers all indicated that this family's past was connected to something much more dangerous than they could have imagined. Dan was ready to leave, but something inside him pulled him on. He couldn't just leave it all behind. Dan couldn't get up and leave. His thoughts were clouded like a thick fog with every step he took, getting closer to those old photos and notes. He looked at the children. Their faces were cold and lifeless, as if they no longer felt the anxiety that tormented him. They looked like they knew more than they could say. What does it all mean? What is it? He asked again, but his voice sounded muffled in the basement, as if absorbed by the dark atmosphere of this place. Lisa didn't answer. She stood in silence while Josh continued to rummage through the old crates. Dan suddenly realized that something was wrong. He felt a chill creeping over his body, not because of the temperature, but because there was a sense of inevitability hanging around this house. Every movement here, every look, even that terrible smell coming from the dampness and mold, was filled with some kind of tension, an unspeakable threat that made no sense, but was inescapable. He felt his heart begin to beat faster. Suddenly, Josh abruptly raised his head and looked at him, but there was not the understanding in his eyes that should have been in his son's eyes. It was a strange look, frightening in its emptiness. He looked at Lisa, and she also didn't seem to notice how her hair began to move, as if something invisible was touching her head. "We have to leave now," Dan said, not hiding the panic in his voice. But it was too late. There was a soft creak from behind the old door leading to the other end of the basement. Dan whirled around, but saw nothing. However, the sound was so clear and ominous that it sent goosebumps down my body. He took a step forward, feeling his breathing become heavy. Then he heard something else. It was a barely noticeable noise, quiet but growing. His heart began to pound with renewed vigor. He looked back at the children. Josh stood absolutely still, like a statue, and Lisa was in the same state, her eyes frozen in a blank stare. They didn't react when he called them, as if they were waiting for something. Dan ran up to them and grabbed Lisa by the shoulder. She didn't move. Only her fingers slowly clenched into fists. He turned her towards him, and her eyes, her daughter's eyes, were no longer human. It wasn't just a blank stare. It was a look that knew no fear. "You don't understand," she whispered softly, barely moving her lips. At that moment, Dan realized that their bodies, their faces, were all alien. They were replaced by something. He stepped back, feeling his legs weaken. He couldn't think. His mind couldn't keep up with what was happening. Then he heard footsteps. Footsteps that were approaching from a dark corner of the basement. It was something alive, something heavy and unnatural, as if it were not human. Dan screamed, turning sharply, and saw a figure emerge from the darkness, but not a human one. It was a body that was not fully formed, sagging like a shadow, and yet possessed some kind of terrifying reality. It moved as if there was no one inside, but there was an indescribable malicious intent in it. Dan couldn't move from fear. He could hear the image approaching. And for a moment I understood. It wasn't the fear of the unknown. It was the fear of something that had been sitting here for a long time, within these walls, in this empty, collapsed life. And suddenly everything became quiet. When Dan came to, the basement was empty, and the children had disappeared as if they had never existed. Everything around them, those old photographs, letters, captured darkness and horror, disappeared as if they had never existed. But the note with the number 19 remained, lying right in front of him. Now that Dan was back in the empty basement, there was only one question left in his mind. Where are they? Dan stood there, terrified, unable to move. He felt his chest tighten, and every breath was difficult. This place was the same as before, but everything was out of place. It was as if the world around him had ceased to be reality. Dan's gaze slid over the dusty walls, which still had traces of old wallpaper that had peeled off under the influence of time and dampness. But now these walls seemed alive to him. It was as if they were breathing, sucking in air, becoming part of something more sinister and incomprehensible. He went to the basement door, and then noticed that the floorboards around it were slightly raised, as if someone had been looking for something here for a long time. Suddenly, Dan felt a strange, unspeakable anxiety emanating from the door itself. It wasn't just closed, it was more than just a basement entrance. She was a barrier. Gritting his teeth, he pushed it open decisively, and the door barely responded, creaking and pitifully echoing in the void. He stepped into the corridor into which her opening opened the way, and then his gaze stopped at something that clearly shouldn't be here. They were old brick walls, with peeling paint, but an inscription was scratched on one of the bricks. "You're not alone here." Dan felt his breath catch in his throat. His legs gave way and he fell to his knees. His heart was pounding wildly, and his whole body was trembling with unbearable fear. He knew it couldn't just be a coincidence. Someone or something was nearby. At that moment, as if in response to his panicked reaction, a sound suddenly rang out of the darkness, so clear and piercing that Dan jumped to his feet, unable to take his eyes off this black abyss. It was as if someone or something was moving in the dark corners of the corridor, getting closer. Dan realized that his fear was not just a consequence of the unknown. He was part of this place, part of what was hidden behind its walls. Every word, every threat left in the letters, was now becoming a reality. He ran. On the other side of the wall, in the corridor, the sound of his footsteps echoed, and suddenly everything disappeared, became quiet. At that moment, he realized that he no longer cared who or what was standing in front of him. He could no longer separate reality from nightmare. Dan was rushing around the house, mindlessly running through empty, broken rooms. He tried to find a way out, but everything was closed. The doors were locked. The windows wouldn't open. There was no way to leave anymore, and his own body had already stopped obeying. He was trapped, and the only question he could ask himself was, why? When everything went quiet and Dan finally stopped, His gaze fell back on the number 19 scratched on the wall. He realized that it was not just a number. It was the number of his own cage. And at that moment, the whole room, all the walls, all the sounds around his body merged into one thing. He became a part of this nightmare, and he knew there was no way out.